Thank you, Sebastian. Indeed, let's dive a bit more into that substrate utilization, depending on the training intensity. And as you have might seen in the previous slide shown by Sebastian, that indeed around fat max there is, of course, and that's kind of logic, a lot of fat oxidation involved. But also quite a lot of carbohydrate oxidation, and that's something that's what I've seen in a lot of coaching circumstances not considered, that these high amounts of carbohydrate oxidation takes place at around fat threshold. I brought this example again. It's the professional cyclist. We have shown this data already in the previous slides, and as you can see, with a fat threshold around 277, 78 watts, the carbohydrate combustion, and I've marked it in a red square here, is around plus 80 grams per hour. This is quite a lot. We will see in some slides or in some recommendations about nutritional intake that this is almost the limit what a human can oxidize from exogenous carbohydrate sources. So definitely something to take into consideration, especially in athletes that are training lots of volumes. For instance, cyclists do is more than 20 hours a week, or triathletes doing more than 30 hours a week and doing multiple sessions a day. Then the carbohydrate oxidation rates are especially to be considered when planning for these type of training sessions. So if we check also a bit around that fat max threshold, and I've shown two power outputs here, 15 watts below the threshold and 15 watts above the threshold, then you can see that it doesn't matter that much when we look at the fat oxidation rates. So they are more or less the same, but it's a big difference in carbohydrate combustion rates. So, and that's of course because of the exponential relationship between carbohydrate combustion and the training intensity, and we are already a bit in the steeper part of this graph. So small deviations in power output can cause enormous increases in carbohydrate oxidation. So is this a problem? Yeah, maybe not. Depends a bit on how you can manage the fuel intake. It's important to note here, and we all read about training strategies with low carbohydrate intake, so that's not a discussion here. That can be a useful training methodology. The discussion I want to explain a bit more in detail is what are possible consequences if you underfuel in carbohydrates in comparison with a high carbohydrate loading strategy during training sessions. And I've taken here a study already a couple of years ago published about well-trained runners who did a training program, 11-day training program, and had to perform in those 11 days for maximal efforts. I think it was an 8-kilometer maximal run. And they have to perform these in two conditions. You see in the open circles the data for the condition with high carbohydrate intake, and with the closed circles you see the condition with the low carbohydrate intake. And what you can see in this graph is that the running speed is more or less the same in the condition with high carbohydrate intake, just a small decrease in speed, but much larger decrease in speed in the condition of low carbohydrate intake. So remember, in athletes doing multiple sessions a day, if you're not taking care of the proper nutrition strategy during training, then you risk to be in this scenario, which is shown here in the black circles, so the low intake. What's not been shown in this graph, but reported in the article, that also mood status, and that's maybe a mark for or a metric that can be used to indicate for overreaching symptoms, is also decreased in athletes with low carbohydrate intake in comparison with the athletes with a high carbohydrate intake. So definitely a recommendation here to take care of fueling strategies, even in what we call of what we read in the literature as moderate intensity, around that fat threshold or just below. There's some lots of carbohydrates that are oxidized at these thresholds. So I brought you through scenarios to athletes or the same athlete with a different metabolic profile. And as you can see here, it's an athlete with a VO2 max of 65 and a VLMX of 0.3 in one scenario and 0.6 in the other scenario. And you see, again, as been shown in previous slides, that metabolic profile has a huge impact on carbohydrate combustion rates, also on fat combustion rates. And you can see in this case, even carbohydrate combustion rates of 110 grams per hour. If we compare with recommendations that has been published in Science, then it's above those values. So I brought this paper, which was a group of Maastricht, who studied or investigated fueling recommendations for athletes and how we can use carbohydrate intakes to promote performance. And the summary of this research is shown in this table, and I marked it a bit in red. So the recommendations here are to use 60 to 90 grams per hour of carbohydrate sources, depending on the duration of effort, of course, and the intensity of effort. But these are in general the recommendations to fuel your training sessions or your races. And as you can see clearly, that these are values that are comparable with the carbohydrate combustion rates in moderate intensity training. Recently, and we have seen that also in professional sports like cyclists, we see the application of even higher carbohydrate intakes, but it's not very clear if this has an added value. And this was studied in the study of Podlogar in well-trained cyclists. So what did they do in the study? They compared carbohydrate intakes as is recommended based on the normal recommendations of 90 grams per hour and compared it with these higher intakes we sometimes see using in elite athletes, 120 grams per hour. And they investigated what the result was of these two carbohydrate intake rates on total carbohydrate oxidation. That's the left graph here on top left. And you can clearly see that when you consume more carbohydrates, you will oxidize more as well. If we look at the fat oxidation rates, that's on the right side here, and panel B, you see the opposite. So the athletes using higher carbohydrate intakes, the red lines here, combust less fat. And if we see what has been oxidized from the carbohydrate sources that they have taken in, so the drinks and gels, you see that, of course, the athletes with higher carbohydrate intakes oxidize more of the carbs they have consumed. The big question here is, does it make any difference on your glycogen stores? That's your endogenous carbohydrate stores, and they showed or they couldn't find any difference. So it looks like that if you consume more than the 90 grams per hour, you will definitely oxidize more, but you will not spare your glycogen stores. So until now, it's not clear if consuming more than 90 grams per hour will have an impact on endurance performance. It's something that should be clarified in more scientific work to be performed. Until now, I would recommend to use the 90 grams as the upper limit of carbohydrate intakes as a rule of thumb. So the recommendations here, it's not necessary to train at fat max to elicit high rates of fat oxidation. So you have seen maybe the graphs, it's like an inverted U-shaped curve, the curve of fat oxidation. So it's not very sharp top, it's more like a flattened curve. So this means that if you deviate a bit from that fat oxidation power output, then it doesn't matter that much when it comes to fat oxidation rate. On the other side, it does make a big difference on carbohydrate oxidation. And especially in athletes doing multiple sessions a day or training lots of volumes on a weekly basis, it's important to be mindful for this and to secure enough energy intake and especially carbohydrate intake to ensure that the athletes are able to do their training sessions, also the intensity training sessions, that even burns more carbohydrates for these ones, and that they can recover from one session to another.